Annalie, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. We currently have self-regulated employment equity targets at companies, and seemingly it has not yielded the desired results. I'm wondering, what are some of the reasons being put forward by companies, and what are the stumbling blocks to these targets as the Commission sees it?
Thank you very much for having us. Yes, and the trend in South Africa has been quite persistent, and the Commission has over time engaged with employers and stakeholders in analysing this. The trend at executive and board management level is seen as rather slow, and it's of course not reflective of the economically active population. So we've seen a 1 percentage point change over a period, and particularly in the last 4 years. The Commission this year did something more in its report, and we've highlighted some of those stumbling blocks. Mostly employers are talking about the skills deficit yet still after all these years, but when we look at the trends, there is a pervasive trend to still promote and recruit and develop within the executive and board management level. And what is also interesting to us is that management control or decision making, we also see quite still a trend of foreign nationals to a large extent. The stumbling blocks are very much in terms of the period of time. So it's of course what you'd think employment equity can do and cannot do. But we are still seeing that at top levels, where we are seeing a movement, and where the Employment Equity Act has seemed to begin to yield its movement in employment equity is in the professionally qualified groups.
It's interesting you mentioned the Act, because last month we saw amendments to the Employment Equity Act, and if passed, it could see firms who don't comply with targets fined up to 10% of their turnover. What does the Commission make of that law?
So let's go back to your earlier question around self-imposed numerical goals. Currently, the Employment Equity Act has always relied on companies setting its own objectives, its own goals to be materialized in terms of its own business objectives. The bill that is now in front of Parliament has recommended that there are sector-specific targets. So considering in engagement with employers in a particular sector is looking at what is more relevant for each particular sector in then setting more specific targets to be achieved over a period of time for that target. So it follows sector engagements where the Commission and the Department of Labour met with employers to ask what are the barriers, why is the transformation perceived as so slow when we get to decision-making levels, and it is fewer jobs. We understand the majority where it's happened, and there was quite a movement to request for sector targets to be more directed and be specific. And so the proposal in Parliament at the moment in the bill is that the Minister would be able to set sector targets. The other aspect that you're referring to is Section 53 of the Act. It's always been there, it's just never been enacted. And that talks about issuing a certificate of employment equity. And people often get confused because this is not broad-based black economic empowerment. This is fairness in employment. And so the other major area of the bill that has been recommended is that Section 53 be enacted.
I'm just going to interject in there because of time's against us, but I want to touch on something you just mentioned, and it was a graphic on your screen. The latest report being released in Women's Month, we know, and we've seen from the stats there's a huge gap in terms of male and female employment here on that particular strata. Is this a general trend throughout sectors in terms of female representation being poor? And I wonder if the picture looks a bit more palatable in the lower positions.
In professionally qualified levels, we are seeing a strong movement to more gender parity. Of course, at senior and top management level, women represents roughly 34%. But what is interesting is the gender discrimination in equal pay for work of equal value. And despite there being legislation dealing with that, we do still see quite a difference in what women earn, particularly at middle to top and executive levels of income. And that is a general trend, yes.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there because time is against us. Annelia Geldenhuys from the Commission for Equity Employment, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.